Good morning and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Frances Steed Sellers, a senior writer at the Washington Post, and host this morning of the new installment of our series, The Path Forward. I'm going to be talking today with Bill Flynn, who's the CEO and president of Amtrak, about the future of train travel. Welcome, Mr. Flynn.
Good morning, Francis. Great to be here.
Well, thanks, Bill. What a time to be taking over Amtrak at this very moment. When you came in earlier this year, Amtrak had just come out of one of its most successful years ever in its 50-year history. Could you update us a little bit now on ridership and revenues?
Sure. Thank you, Francis. You're right. Amtrak, when it finished fiscal year 2019, had made substantial progress over the last 3 to 4 years and was looking forward to a tremendous opportunity in fiscal year 20 to have a break even or better year for the first time in its history. What was achieved really over those 3 or 4 years was the company built a tremendous foundation in terms of quality of service, growth in ridership, and particularly ever increasing scores in customer satisfaction. And I mention that foundation because it's important to have that in mind as we think about not only this fiscal year, but as we think about our mid to long-term future as a company. So clearly, ridership was affected in 2020, much the same as virtually every industry was as a result of the pandemic. Our ridership dropped to just 3% of what it would have been at a normal rate. In other words, we were carrying about 3,000 passengers a day in April of this year when we would have been carrying something north of 90,000. Ridership's begun to gradually improve, but we really have a long way to go to recapture the level of ridership that we experienced in 2019. One
Right,
thing I
and so
really,
you
if I may, Francis, just one thing I want to underscore before we go further
have.
in our discussion here today is I just want to recognize the people of Amtrak and in particular our frontline people, our people who are at the stations, our people who are working, as red caps, handling our customers' baggage, our conductors and onboard service people, our locomotive engineers, and our people who report to our dispatch centers, mechanical and engineering. The largest part of our company, the largest part of our team can't work from home. They're essential
Right.
workers. They have to show up at some risk, and they've done a great job and provided this essential service throughout this pandemic, and we just couldn't do it without them. And I want to make sure they're really recognized, for the courage they
Right.
have in the work.
Right. You have moved during your 34-year career, cargo and people around the world on almost every form of transportation, by air, by freight, by train, by ship, by boat. But I guess nothing could really prepare you for the coronavirus pandemic.
Well, I don't think we've ever experienced anything like a global pandemic that we have now. I did live in Asia when we had the outbreak of SARS and saw the impact and swine flu on volumes and business activity when I was living in Japan and later on in Hong Kong when I was in the ocean shipping business. Certainly from a public health point of view, as I mentioned a moment ago, we've not seen something global
Mm.
such as we're seeing today.
So I've had friends who've just chosen to take a train all the way to Florida rather than flying. Do you believe that taking a train is safer than taking an airplane at this point?
I think taking a train and taking an Amtrak train is really a great option for anyone considering travel today. We've implemented a wide range of measures, certainly informed by CDC guidance and other authorities' guidance. I believe we've gone over and above. For example, we're limiting the capacity that will book on our trains to 50%. So that essentially means that if you're traveling as an individual, you'll have the seat next to you empty. If you're traveling as a family, of course, you can travel in a group. We're requiring that face masks be worn in our stations and on board our trains. Uh, we're moving as much as we practically can to a contactless experience, whether that's checking in at our kiosk, using our app so that you're no longer carrying a ticket. Our conductors can scan your ticket or scan your QR code on your phone. We have plexiglass shields installed in our stations as well, and in our cafe car we have takeout where you can purchase a meal and bring it back to your seat, for example, or have service delivered to your sleeper if you're on on one of those trains. And just something else that's we've begun to research and better understand over the last several weeks is that when you look at how the virus is transmitted in the air, um, in the cabin or of our trains in our trains, we have tremendous fresh air exchange, and our fresh air exchange is some fairly significant multiple of what happens inside, say, the pressurized cabin of an airplane. So we're doing more research to understand how that is a very really important attribute and feature of riding in a train, riding in an Amtrak train.
So just follow up a little bit on that, because obviously we can't open windows in a train these days as you used to be able to in the past. But you have fresh air brought in above our
Through
heads
our
as you wouldn't, but circulating with fresh air, not just recirculating air.
Oh, absolutely, with fresh air. So substantial recirculation throughout the trip. And we think, again, there's not a full array of science on that as of yet, but it's research we're doing, and we're in discussion with passenger railroad systems in Europe and in Asia as well to learn from their experience and perhaps benefit from their insight as well.
So I have a reader question that I want to ask you. You've partially answered it when you talked about single seating at the moment, not having somebody next to you. But Val Snyder from Colorado asks, will you be installing plexiglass between seats? Now, I guess that could become an issue, right, if you decide to go beyond 50% capacity or whatever you're talking about at the moment.
Right, Val. No, thank you, Val, for that question. No, we're not going to be installing plexiglass between the seats. We have plexiglass in our stations at our ticket counters. We have a full array of cleaning and all implementing all of the CDC guidelines. We will and do not will, but we do require that our passengers wear face masks while on board, and certainly our onboard uh, conductors and service staff do as well.
So you talked very movingly about the staff that you depend on, that we see the red caps and everybody else who work at the stations. What about staff safety? How much contact tracing, or more importantly, probably testing, are you doing? I think one of the unions said that as many as 100 Amtrak employees may have been exposed. How are you addressing concerns like that now?
Well, in terms of how this virus acts and how it spreads, that's been really our day one concern. And like the rest of the country, we've been learning more about that as we go along. We have our own medical department headed by Dr. Cunin. We have our own public health department as well. And I believe that Amtrak was early on in introducing enhanced cleaning protocols and other measures before even we had definition from CDC. We certainly covered the cost of all testing or any testing that any of our employees would wish to have. We've encouraged and strongly encouraged our employees, if they're not feeling well, to do a number of things: to take advantage of the testing, to not report to work, to quarantine themselves for a period of 14 days. We're covering all of the medical costs involved, and should someone contract COVID, we will cover, of course, all of the medical costs for them as a result of COVID. And again, testing is something that it depends state by state, given the availability, what the availability of testing may be. And as I mentioned a moment ago, any of our employees who wants to be tested will certainly direct them to their testing facilities as provided by the state that they live in, and cover all of those costs.
So before coming to Amtrak, you spent 13 years at Atlas Air. What are some of the differing challenges between air and rail transportation travel and getting people around?
Well, they're quite different, as you know. I think what strikes me about where we are with Amtrak today more than anything else is the mid to long term tremendous growth opportunities that Amtrak has. As we think about not just our Northeast corridor, but as our state supported routes, which are part of our national network, and on our long distance routes and points in between on the long distance routes, I believe there's a tremendous opportunity for Amtrak. And so, what excited me among several key things in terms of the opportunity to become a part of Amtrak and join the team was this mid to long term growth opportunity that I believe our company has. And with the given set of circumstances, an appropriate and meaningful level of investment, I believe we could double our traffic from some 32, 33 million passengers a year to 64 million or so over the next 20 years. I
So
think
what are your
that's
apologies for interrupting you there. What are your top priorities now, and how have you had to adjust them in light of what's happened? What is your main goal coming in? And
sure. Our number one goal is safety and security and ensuring that we continue to drive the absolute highest level of performance of safety and safety outcomes across the company. Uh, Building on that, because that's foundational in my mind for everything else we do, it's to continue to drive the quality and of our product, of our service, to drive on-time performance and invest in the other components of our service that are going to drive very high rates of customer satisfaction. And in doing so, that's really the foundational uh, uh, basis we need to have that's going to propel our growth. So safety, service, and customer satisfaction are really the three areas that I'm absolutely focused.
so the Northeast Corridor is one of your busiest areas, and you have a new Acela, I think, prep to come next year. Is that on schedule? I believe it'll go 165 miles an hour. How much time will that cut off those routes that we're familiar with between, say, Washington and New York?
Sure. So we're anticipating that we'll get our first two Acela 21s delivered in 2021, and expect to have 8 full train sets in operation by the end of the year. That's something we continue to calibrate because COVID has had some impact on the rate of manufacturing, but it is our expectation to have a number of our 28 total train sets in service in 2021. The train sets themselves offer about a 25% increase in capacity over our current Acela. They provide, as you pointed out, very high speeds, which of course we're up to 165 miles an hour. We're making a broad a range of investments in our track, in our stations, and our ability to service the equipment. And we think it's going to be an exceptional product for our customers. A lot of the individual features within the Acela train itself, seating, Wi-Fi, accessibility for all of our customers. All of that, the choices we've made there have been informed by substantial research with our customers to make sure we're making the right choices around the product and what our customers will come to expect from that Acela 21.
And how much time will that save us, say, between Washington and New York?
Well, it could save us up. Well, it depend on the route and the stations, but it could save, somewhere 15 minutes or so. We're still finalizing that, but that's quite a bit.
And these trains, 165 miles an hour is obviously very fast, much slower than Asian trains and European trains that we know about. Will we ever have trains traveling at those sort of comparable speeds, several hundred miles an hour?
Well, those are the speeds you're talking about are maximum speeds. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the average speed that the trains run, because they're particularly in Europe, they're running over relatively shorter distances. If we're thinking, about taking a train from Frankfurt to Bonn, or taking a train from Tokyo to Nagoya. So I think at 165 miles an hour, looking at the length of haul that these trains have and the distance between stops, they are indeed comparable to what one might find on similar distances between cities in both European and Asian train operation.
So I have another reader question. This is from Perry Seaton. I'm going to read it to you. Perry Seaton in Missouri, who says, what will be needed in terms of infrastructure and funding to bring high-speed rail to large parts of the US? So he's thinking obviously beyond the Northeast Corridor.
Well, it's going to take a substantial investment, sustained investment over many years to bring high-speed rail to areas of the country that would be able to support high-speed rail in terms of levels of ridership. But it's a substantial investment in infrastructure, and it will require, as we are today, our ability to reach agreement with our freight railroads, our host railroads, to be able to operate long distance, high speed rails across that network. So a lot of work to be done.
This year, Congress gave you 1.4, 1.5 billion, I think, from the CARES Act. Will you be needing more? Where will that take you? And what is it allowing you to do at this point?
So under the CARES Act this year, we received just over $1 billion, and that was to address the impact that COVID's had on the business, or on our company, I should say, between March and the end of the fiscal year in September of this year. In February of this year, we submitted our request for FY21 funding. Just a little bit north of $2 billion was the request. And we amended that request just recently to ask for an additional $1.475 billion to address the shortfall in revenue and results that we're going to have as a result of COVID. Our planning assumption now is that we'll handle about 50% of the ridership in fiscal year 2021, call that 16 and a half million riders, that we compared to the level of ridership we had in fiscal year 19, which was just a little over 32 million riders. And so we're doing a number of things. So we've asked for the $1.457 billion, as you pointed out. We're looking to reduce costs within the company in the range of about another $500 million. And of course, we have our base supplemental of $2 billion that we requested.
So Amtrak has historically been very dependent on government subsidies, and you're talking very ambitiously about the future. Do you see a future for Amtrak that could be profit-making without those subsidies?
Well, in terms of on an operating cost basis, we believe what Amtrak provides is an exceptional value to our customers. You know, by legislation, we run as a for-profit business. But I do believe that substantial investment is going to be needed to address our infrastructure. If we just think, first of all, for example, on the NEC, where we think about the bridges and tunnels and underlying track infrastructure, there are assets, key assets on that corridor that date from the 1890s, for example, the BMP tunnel,
Right.
or the
Right.
across Connecticut. That is going to call for billions of dollars to get over time to get those assets to a state of good repair, and beyond repair. Many of these assets simply need to be fundamentally replaced. As we look across the network more broadly, we certainly need to continue to invest in infrastructure across that network. That infrastructure, in my mind, also includes rolling stock, not typically thought of as infrastructure, but we're about, in addition to our Acela 21, we're looking to make an investment in a new fleet of intercity trains that will serve all components of Amtrak, the long distance network, the state supported network, and of course our Northeast corridor. There's going to be investment required on our host railroads that we're going to have to look to do to build passing sidings, for example, to allow for a greater accommodation to fulfill, our preference right of access on freight rails, with passing sidings that'll accommodate longer trains that uh, precision scheduled railroading has introduced into the network.
So one of the big projects you've embarked on, or your predecessors did, was the Gateway program, which I think has cost 300 million. Excuse me. Update us on where that stands and what the future for that is and what change it could make.
Well, Gateway program is a long, multi-year process. It's a series of
Mm.
bridges and other infrastructure in the New Jersey side. And for example, you've just seen funding for the Portal North Bridge being confirmed, and we're 90% there. But it's all the way through to new tunnels under the Hudson and substantial development of Penn Station as well. So that's a long, as I said, multi-year process. There are segments. Gateway is really the accumulation or the accumulation of multiple projects, and there is quite a bit of work yet to be done to move that project forward. And funding is a key part of it, of course.
We've had a lot of nostalgia and practical concerns from listeners about the long distance trains, some of which you've cut to 3 days a week from 5 days a week. There's been bipartisan support for long distance trains. Why not invest heavily in that? Why the cuts in long distance, which concerns some people, particularly in underserved communities across the country?
Yes, the long distance network is an essential part of Amtrak's national network, and it's a service we're fully committed to. Um, um, and I want to be clear on that. And you're right, there's bicameral, bipartisan support for the long distance network, and we fully understand that. Right now, we are running essentially a full long distance service. When we look at our Northeast Corridor and our state-supported network, the network, the long distance network, has had the least amount of service reduction in FY 2021. That's part of the discussion we had with Congress in the request for the $1 billion that we received under the CARES Act. What we have announced is that we are going to reduce most, not all, but 10 out of the 15 long distance trains to a 3-day a week service for the winter. Right. And that is the period of time when we have the lowest level of ridership on the long distance network. Now, we're not going to be reducing the auto train because that's a peak time for the auto train, for example. What we've said
This is
is
the
that
train, the auto train is the train, just for listeners, from Lawton, Virginia down to Florida.
yes, that's right, Francis. Thanks for clarifying that. Yes, that's the train service that we're talking about. So that these reductions will go into effect in October, which is right at the time that the long distance network, other than auto train and one or two other trains perhaps, goes into its lowest level of ridership. Uh, and then we will be evaluating those trains and train service along with other indicators. I'll come to those in a moment of our ability then to restore service on kind of a service by service plan as we come into the spring and the late spring and into the summer, which is the highest level of ridership for those long distance trains. So we'll be looking at just bookings and level of ridership. We'll have to just look at where we are in terms of COVID-19 and the pandemic, and God forbid there's a second wave. We'll want to also understand just Amtrak's financial conditions and just broader levels of demand, not just demands for Amtrak, but broader levels of demand for air services, for example. So, and we're communicating our criteria and how we're thinking about a restoration of long distance, certainly to the representative committees and very interested members on the Hill as well.
So I do want to ask you about food, which I know has been the topic of various news articles, but the old romance of the white tablecloth and served steak is something that people miss. Our readers have told us so, our listeners have told us so, and it's certainly part of the romance of train travel. Do you see that ever coming back, or are we going to be having packaged meals on those trains, assuming they'll be running 5 days a week again?
Well, actually, 7 days a week when we're
Well,
full
7 days a
service.
week.
on the LD. Well, I know there's certainly a lot of discussion about food services, and it's our goal to provide a quality food service to our passengers on our trains where food service is indeed a part of the experience. Um, we provide flexible services now. Certainly, COVID is driving that right now. As you know, food is available on our trains, but food has to be consumed either at your seat or in your room if you're in a sleep
Right.
or in a roomette, and that will continue for some time.
Well, thank you. I think I have time for one very short question. 2020, presidential election year, we have Amtrak Joe running against President Trump, who has threatened cuts. What could 2020 mean for Amtrak? And I'm afraid we need to keep this one short, but give me your thoughts.
I think what 2020 means for Amtrak is probably better described by Chairman DeFazio's bill, HR2. And in HR2, which is a comprehensive transportation and infrastructure package of legislation, Chairman DeFazio and really the committee itself has outlined, in my mind, a very bright future for Amtrak, a ringing endorsement for Amtrak and the essential services that we provide, with a vision to the company that we can indeed become. Contained within that legislation are some very important features for us, including our rights of access, our ability to ultimately enforce that access, and a substantial amount of funding that addresses certainly infrastructure, state of good repair, and the ability to expand our services across the United States.
Bill Flynn, thank you very much for joining us. I'm Frances Steed Sellers from the Washington Post Live team. Later on this afternoon, we'll have Jonathan Capehart, my colleague, talking to Stacey Abrams, the former Georgia legislator who's leading a national effort to prevent voter suppression. You can find out details at washingtonpostlive.com. Many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.